I'm Jonathan Shaw, creator of the DTO system and founder of the DTO Academy. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you about triggers. Now, in the last video, I talked to you about memories and how memories and traumas affect us. And before that, I went into three things that cause all of our problems: the memories, the triggers, and the behaviors. If you haven't seen those videos, go back and watch those videos because they lead up to this video, which today is all about triggers. How do triggers affect us? Now, triggers are a little bit more complex. Negative memories and traumas, we can kind of see that because if we look back and we think about the memory, we know how it makes us feel. And a lot of people can get their heads around that. A lot of people can see that memories and traumas would be causing a problem. Some people can't, but hopefully they've watched my video and they now can. But some people can see that. But how do triggers affect us? Where do triggers come in? Now, triggers are a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to explain the different types of triggers in another video. But in this video, I'm going to explain how triggers affect us today. So I'm going to give you some examples of some very common triggers that are neutral, and then some examples of triggers that can affect us in our life. Now, what do I mean by a trigger? A trigger is something that we see, hear, taste, smell, touch, or feel. And when I say feel, I don't mean emotion, I mean sense, like different textures and things like that, that then triggers a response, like a thought or an emotion. So we might see something, we might see someone's body language, or we might hear a tone of voice, like an angry tone, and that triggers a response in us. It triggers off a feeling or a belief. So if we see someone that is angry, and our father was angry, it might trigger off fear in us, and we might get really scared, or we might shut down and be really, really quiet because we don't want to offend them, because it's triggered a response in us, and then we act and behave in a certain way. Now, there are some very common triggers. The most obvious trigger is a favourite song. We all understand that songs trigger us, and we're in a loving relationship. We hear a really lovely song, and it's the most loving thing in the world. And oh my God, I love you, sweet, darling. Oh, it's lovely. And then when you break up, if you do, try to, you know, don't want, if don't want to be pessimistic, but if you do break up with that person, I can't speak today for some reason. I don't know what that's about. It's really hot. So if you do break up with someone, then that song is the worst song in the world, isn't it? And you hear it everywhere. It comes on the radio. It's in every shop that you walk in, and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that song's on again. And it reminds you of the relationship, but in a bad way. Now, that's an example of how a trigger can be positive and then move to negative again. And that's quite interesting the way that does that. So that's an example of a common trigger in life. Other triggers are traffic lights. Now, these are neutral. You see a red light, you stop. You see a green light, you go. It's a good trigger. That's not bad. That you don't need to switch that off, and I wouldn't. But that's a trigger as well. Everything is actually a trigger around us. Everything we see, hear, taste, touch, smell are triggers. And there are neutral triggers, there are positive triggers, and there are negative triggers. So obviously neutral and positive ones we don't need to worry about. It's the negative triggers we need to worry about. So when we see a table, we know it's a table, we might think, oh, food. Or if we see a cup, so I'll often do this in clinic, I'll often hold up a glass or a cup and say, when you see that, what do you think? So while you're watching this right now, when you see that, what do you think? You might think, oh, cup of tea. Or you might think, oh, I like that flower pattern. Or you might think, my mum's got a cup like that. Or you might think, if you're OCD, you might think, that's dirty, he needs to wash that. My girlfriend would probably agree with you. Um, you might have different responses based on your perception of what you're seeing. And that's the beauty of it. When we look round at things, we all respond differently to what we're seeing, even to something as neutral as a cup. And that's really amazing. When I say this to people in clinic, they respond all different ways. Now, that's just a neutral trigger. It often doesn't mean anything, a cup. A positive trigger can be stopping at a red light and going at a green light. It can be your favourite song, and it can evoke really lovely emotions from the past. But negative triggers, they can trigger a whole world of information that you just really don't want to come up. It can trigger all your emotional responses. It can trigger belief systems and behaviours, and you don't realise it because triggers can be very subtle. The song is actually an obvious one, and that's why I use that as an example. But some people don't realize how subtle triggers actually are. I'm going to give you an example of some subtle triggers. So one of my clients, she had this massive alone response. Now, she was in her late 30s, and she's a physio, and she'd never felt alone in her life. And all of a sudden, for the past 3 or 4 months, at this period of time, when she had this problem, she started feeling really alone. And the first trigger was when she walked into her home and she saw the empty walls. This was one of the first triggers. So when she saw, I switched that off, and that eased that calmed it right down. But there was still something left, and it went to a trigger of hearing her car door click shut. Now that is such a subtle trigger. It's random. It has nothing to do with anything. But what happened is her mind had obviously associated the clicking of that car door to this alone response. So every time she heard that, she felt alone. And when I switched off that trigger, the alone feeling just vanished. It just went away and she's never had it since. So just those two triggers made up that alone response. Another example, one of my clients had severe depression, and what would happen is he'd wake up in the mornings and before he'd even open his eyes, he felt depressed. So he hadn't seen anything. He could have heard something, but he lived in a quiet area, so he wasn't hearing anything. What he was doing was he was feeling the mattress on his back. And that was triggering his depression because he'd anchored that feeling to his depression. Obviously, a mattress can't cause depression because it's an animate object. It's not moving, it's just laying there. Very much like it doesn't actually cause pain. That's just a myth. People go, oh, it's my mattress. No, it's an inanimate object. It's not doing anything to you. It's a myth. It's a great way to sell mattresses and beds and you name it, and pillows, but it doesn't actually cause you chronic pain. It might cause you an awkward sleep night, but it doesn't cause you chronic consistent pain. I know because I've treated it. But I digress. In this case, it was triggering his pain, his depression, sorry. And so once we switched that off, some of the depression lifted. Another one of my clients lifted. Another one of my clients, when he went home and he slid the bolt across his gate, caused him to be depressed. He was going through a divorce, and he had two main triggers for it. One was his wife's name coming up on his mobile phone, and the other one was his bolt sliding across the gate. And when I lifted those two triggers off, 50% of it vanished, and the other percentage of it was caused by a past memory of his dad abandoning him. So, can you see how the memory was something completely different? It was being abandoned by his father, and then later on, he was having two triggers, which nothing to do with abandonment. They were just to do with this loss of the relationship and the loss of his kids. And the combination of that memory and those two triggers was causing his depression. So triggers are very, very important. They can be very subtle or they can be very obvious. Now, obviously, an obvious trigger would be like a noise or like so PTSD, for instance, people who suffer PTSD, a lot of their triggers are hearing explosions, hearing guns going off, any loud noise or any horrible image. So they can be triggered when they're out in the street by a car going off. They could be triggered by watching a war movie. You know, one of my clients, she wasn't in the war, but when she was a child, when she was 4 years old, she remembers her dad sitting her down in front of TV, making her watch war movies at 4. So she had all these explosions and bombs and guns going off in her head, and this was part of her anxiety as she got older. So much so that when she was older, just walking down her father's road to his house was triggering her because it was bringing back that anxiety from listening to all those guns going off. So that's an example of how subtle triggers can affect us and how more obvious triggers can affect us. Now, everyone has their own triggers, and some will be more subtle than others. But I guarantee if you have a problem, if you are having a problem at work right now, or you're having a problem with your partner right now, or you're having a health issue right now, you're being triggered by something. And with health issues, it can be both. It can be the original cause is triggering. So let's say you have abuse running in your life, that causes a lot of health issues. If you've been abused and you haven't dealt with it, it creates a lot of health issues in your body. But also the actual symptom you're getting can be a trigger. So, for instance, if you feel pain, so one of my clients, nothing to do with abuse, she had a problem at work and it was causing her knee problems. She felt in competition with somebody at work and it was causing her to have knee problems. Now, this lady was in her late 60s, early 70s, and it was affecting her job because she was a swimming coach and she now felt in competition. So I switched off that memory trauma of being competition, but she still had some residual pain. And when I looked at it, the feeling the pain was triggering a belief that she was getting old, that she was older. And so just the feeling of being in pain or it being stiff was triggering her to go, oh, I'm getting old, it's my age, oh no. And that was a problem. So when I switched off the trigger of the pain, the belief went away and the pain went away and the problem resolved itself. So that's an example of how symptoms can actually trigger us as well when we're ill, because we develop beliefs about our symptoms. We develop beliefs about what it means if we're in pain, or what it means to us, or how it's going to affect us. And so then that feeling of pain or tension or whatever it is we have in our body causes a belief system, and we get triggered by it. So that's another example of how triggers can actually affect our health. And that's actually very common, and that's kind of a subtle trigger because we don't think it's doing that. We're not aware that it's doing that. We just think that's a fact. And I can tell you my entire over 20-year experience of treating chronic pain, age has nothing to do with it. I've treated everyone from 2-year-olds to 92-year-olds, and age has absolutely nothing to do with it. So that's just a belief system. So triggers are very powerful, and they can create different responses in us depending on how they're created and the type of trigger it is. So remember, there are three types of triggers. There are neutral ones, there are positive ones, and there are negative ones. And triggers are sounds, images, smells, tastes, touches, and sensations. The most common ones are sounds and images. People's body language, tone of people's voice, certain words that people say. One of my triggers I used to be hearing my dad say, "You're a jack of all trades and master of none." That used to play in my brain. And so I would hearing that, and that's an example of not a current trigger, but a past trigger. And I'm going to explain it in another video, because there is something about triggers I want to explain, because triggers can be a little bit more complex than that. So it's not just about external triggers, there can be other triggers around you. So I'm going to explain that in another video. But for now, just think about triggers and pay attention. Pay attention in your world. Think, okay, well, what's triggered me? When you have an emotional response, think, what's triggered me? When you're ill, when you're suffering, you've got pain, think, well, what triggered that? When you've got a problem with your boss at work, think, well, what's triggered that? What is triggering me? Ask yourself these questions. Once you start asking the questions, the right questions, you will find the right answers. If we go back to the first video about the three things that cause our problems, I talked about blame in that video and how we blame external things. When we do that, we can't find the solution. We can't see the answer, so we can't solve it. But if we go, right, what's triggering me? Now your brain's going to come up with the answer, because that is the right thing. You just need to know, you need to ask your brain the question so it can come up with the information. So a lot of it's about just asking the brain the right questions. So now I'm giving you the right questions. You could ask, what is this reminding me of? And find the memory or the trauma from the past. When you think of, when a situation bothers you, go, what's this remind me of? Oh, it reminds me of school. Oh, it reminds me of dad. Oh, it reminds me of mum. Oh, it reminds me of the vacation I went on where I fell in love with a beautiful little girl, whatever it might be. So it might remind you of different things, or what's triggering it. What's triggering me today? What triggered that response? Those two questions are perfect to ask yourself to start finding the answer to your problems. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did enjoy that video, then if you're on Facebook, like, share, love the video. If you're on YouTube, subscribe, click the notification bell so you get notified of future videos. And if you want to speak to me in person, if you have a private question or you want my help, then you can reach out to me at jonathan@thedtosystem.com. Or if you want to learn DTO for yourself and start learning how to switch off your own negative memories, then you can go to www.thedtoacademy.com and you can sign up for free and start learning the 7-day introductory free training on the DTO system, so you can learn how to clear your own little negative memories. Don't do it on traumas just yet, just stick to basic memories. And that's absolutely free. You can start learning to do it yourself. Because as I always say, if people learn to take care of their thoughts and their emotions, then the world will be a much happier place. And I truly believe that there is no reason to be ill or suffering. And if we can just learn to heal our past memories and traumas, our triggers, our behaviors, the world will be a much healthier, happier place. I hope you enjoyed that video. Until next time, stay healthy, stay happy, keep smiling, and I'll speak to you soon.